Was speaking of one of the states that, the red states that still has some room to enact new pro-gun laws. As you mentioned earlier in the show, Georgia is moving to be would actually they could be the 25th state. There's 24 now because you had Alabama, Ohio, and Indiana all adopt it this year.
Yeah, Indiana beat it. Georgia was going to be the 24th, and Indiana's beat them now.
Yeah, so, Indiana got there first, but it seems pretty clear that Georgia's going to get there before the end of this session, right?
So the squabbling over the House and Senate is somewhat nuanced, and it's over governmental buildings. The Senate version did not include a prohibition on carrying guns into governmental buildings, and the House version does. I'm sympathetic to the Senate version and saying you should be able to carry them. The problem is in Georgia, a good number of state governmental buildings are also federal governmental buildings, and you can't carry a gun into a federal governmental building. And so the House put that clarification in there because, I mean, we obviously don't want people carrying a gun into a state governmental entity that also is a federal entity and they get carted off to jail.
Right.
They're squabbling over how to deal with that language and reconcile it. But it looks like probably either the end of this week or the beginning of next week, they'll have a clean version of it that both sides intend to pass.
Yeah. And I mean, it seems likely that that's going to get worked out. And also that Governor Brian Kemp, the Republican incumbent, is going to sign. I mean, he was actually on our podcast a couple of weeks ago talking about this issue in particular. And he's promised to sign it. He promised to sign it at an event with a lot of the NRA backing to it. So, I don't think there's any doubt that Georgia's going to get to permitless carry this year unless something really weird happens in this conference committee session that they're having now. But can you talk a little bit about why this issue matters so much in this race? Because obviously it's an important race, especially in the sort of grander scale of things. Because Brian Kemp was, somebody that angered former President Donald Trump during the election, and to the point where Trump has now endorsed his primary opponent, David Perdue, who's the former senator from Georgia who lost in 2020. This is a really important race from a national political standpoint. Why is permitless carry or constitutional carry so important in this race?
So there's a little bit of history here that you got to understand. The David Perdue campaigned for Brian Kemp in 2018 against Stacey Abrams. David Perdue, up until the month before he decided to run, was telling people he wasn't going to run, that Brian Kemp was a great conservative and a great governor. But somehow or another, the Trump campaign team convinced him to run. They did an internal poll that showed he would unite the party and run away with the race. Didn't turn out to be the case. The polling told Perdue what he wanted to hear, but wasn't reality. But Kemp does have a problem with conservatives in the state. Many conservatives very pro-Trump. They blame Brian Kemp for Donald Trump not winning Georgia. They think the race was stolen in Georgia. Whether you think the race was stolen or not, the governor in Georgia has no control over the Secretary of State. Kemp had been Secretary of State and knows there's a firewall in the Georgia Constitution. Governors are not allowed to play any role whatsoever under the sun when it comes to elections. The most Kemp could do would be to call a special session of the Georgia legislature. The Trump team wanted him to call it and throw out the Electoral College votes, which legally no one thinks would have worked other than the Trump team.
Right.
The other thing they wanted was to call a special session and change the election rules for the runoff election for the 2 Senate seats in January 2021. That would have been unconstitutional as well. There's Georgia constitutional precedent. You can't change election rules from a general election to the runoff from that general election. So there was no reason to do that. But because of those two things, they say, well, Kemp didn't do everything he could. He didn't fight. He certified the results, which they didn't want him to do. Under Georgia law, you cannot contest the results until they're certified. So if Kemp hadn't certified them, the president could have never contested the election. It would have gone to Congress just without Georgia's Electoral College votes, which wouldn't have mattered. So they came up with a lot of excuses to say Brian Kemp didn't do what he needed to do. They tried to find multiple candidates to run against him. I'm told multiple people, including the guy who ran again in 2018, Casey Cagle apparently was considered, and to no avail. So they finally were able to convince David Perdue a month after he doubled down on supporting Brian Kemp, convinced him to run. And their attacks were twofold. Brian Kemp's not a conservative, and Brian Kemp helped the Democrats steal the election.
And I think there's one more wrinkle there too, which is that, Perdue's loss in that runoff, there's at least some people who argue it was in large part because Donald Trump's attacks on the election.
I'm one of those people.
So
I can give you the exact number there. 427,205 Republicans who voted in the November general election stayed home in that January runoff. I mean, we know who they are. We can pull the registered voter list and see who showed up in November and who showed up in January. It's easy to determine if they're Republican or Democrat. 427,000 Republicans out of 700,000 people stayed home. Perdue lost by 90,000 votes. He lost after Donald Trump came to Georgia. The Georgia GOP chairman and Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene and others all said the election was stolen. It was going to be stolen again. In fact, the Democrats all over Georgia put up billboards as like a Republican front group and said, don't bother, they're going to steal it again, and totally turned Republican voters off. The largest decline in voting was in North Georgia, where Marjorie Taylor Greene is the congresswoman. It was where the last major Mike Pence rally was to try to get out the vote. People didn't show up. Republicans didn't show up. So they lost that. Brian Kemp had nothing to do with that. Mm-hmm. They talked themselves out of it. In fact, the Kemp team, after that election, blamed Donald Trump and David Schaefer, the chairman of the Georgia GOP, and Marjorie Taylor Greene for suppressing the vote. They never blamed Brian Kemp. This idea from the Trump team or from the Perdue team that it was Brian Kemp's fault is a very new thing because for months on end, for almost an entire year, Perdue defended Brian Kemp, said there was nothing he could do, and Republicans talked themselves out of voting. So all of this comes to a head now, and Kemp's trying to show he's a conservative, and one of his big issues is constitutional carry. He campaigned on it in 2018. He never actually brought it to the legislature with the force of the governor's office to get it passed. He saved it until his reelection bid, which was a smart thing to do, frankly, because it gives him something to run on. And meanwhile, the Perdue team is still running on 2020 was stolen, and he can't get above, I think, 38% in the polls. So now he's trying to find ways to attack Brian Kemp's leadership, which he defended up until December of last year. It makes it very hard for Perdue. In fact, it's so bad for Perdue that the Brian Kemp team has even stopped talking about him. They're only focused on Stacey Abrams at this point.
Yeah, and obviously we talked to the Perdue campaign after Kemp came on the show, and their argument is that obviously Kemp had actually Stacey Abrams made this. We talked to her campaign as well, and they both kind of made a similar argument about Kemp, which is that he did support this back in 2018, but hasn't done anything to get it passed until now. And it sounds like you agree with that to some degree. Is that a legitimate complaint to bring up about the Governor Kemp's support for this policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I don't think that he would not bring it up, but he waited until he needed to bring it up to rally conservatives. Mm-hmm. They've also had a couple of legislative sessions that were very difficult dealing with tax issues. For example, the 2020 legislative session then immediately turned into a COVID session. They had to wind down and operate remotely. So in 2020 and 2021, you're dealing with the budgetary fallout for COVID. There was no appetite in the legislature for it. So he really only had the 2019 legislative session, and he was the new governor establishing parameters and priorities. Guns at the time really weren't his priority. It was giving teacher pay raises, thrown into the economic whirlwind of COVID. And now finally he's got a clean opportunity to do it.
Right. And that is essentially what Kemp told us when we talked to him on the show, that, COVID kind of threw a wrench into some of the plans. And then I believe also that the Republicans in the legislature backed off on passing permitless carry in 2021 because the shootings at the in Atlanta.
Yeah, I forgot about that one. That was one of the issues as well. You had the Asian theme massage parlor shootings. Yeah. They claimed it was anti-Asian hate. The media began to pile on there, so they kind of wound it down at the time as a politically high-risk thing to do.
Yeah, and that wasn't really Kemp's decision. That was more
Yeah, so you got to understand that the Speaker of the House in Georgia kind of controls the agenda in the state legislature. If he doesn't want something, it doesn't get through. And he has, for the last number of years, even before Kemp, blocked a lot of Second Amendment issues, and you've had to build a groundswell of support. For example, for years he blocked legislation that would allow college students to keep their firearms in their dormitories in state colleges. It was only after groundswell of attention, after a couple of students were shot and killed in Georgia, that he allowed that through the legislature.
Yeah, and so obviously it's not all up to Kemp, but certainly that's been the criticism, is that he waited until now to back this bill. I suppose if he does get it through, I mean, when he came on, he was talking about keeping his promises, and so if he gets it passed and signed into law this year before the election, I suppose that still counts as him keeping his promise.
Yeah. Look, he will campaign on it hard.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and how that whole race plays out, given the dynamics that you described there. It's obviously extremely relevant race for the Republican Party, even well beyond Georgia.